much. So thanks everyone for coming to our first panel discussion, and ours is on outsourced product development. I'd like to introduce our panelists first. First of all, on the left, Kim Rodriguez has nearly 20 years of medical device experience in cardiology, radiology, vascular surgery, neurology, women's health. She currently serves as president and CEO of Acessa Health, a privately held company that develops minimally invasive uterine-sparing solutions for women who suffer from symptomatic fibroids. Kim's held numerous VP and management roles at companies like Spectranetics, Blockade Medical, Stryker Neurovascular, Concentric Medical, J&J, Guidant, and EV3. So welcome, Kim. And also with us this morning is Stuart Karten, the president of the award-winning LA-based product design and innovation consultancy, Karten Design. Stuart's a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, and prior to founding Karten, worked for Gould Medical Products, Mattel, and Baxter Medical. We do the secret Baxter handshake later. He's a founding member of the University of Southern California Center for Body Computing, and is a member of the Stanford Medicine X Council of Healthcare Designers. My name is Jim Reed. I run sales and marketing for Minnetronix. Okay, sorry. You start. My name is Jim Reed. I run sales and marketing for Minnetronix Medical. We're a med tech company based out of St. Paul, Minnesota, just short of 400 people. We've been doing med tech design, development, manufacturing for about 20 years, for about 200 companies over that time, taking a lot of products to market. So that's a little bit of my background in Minnetronix. I thought before we get into the questions, I would take just a few minutes and kind of set the stage. Some of it's stuff that's already sort of glaringly obvious, but I think it's relevant. I joined the industry back in '91, and the industry has changed a lot over that period of time. Commercialization cycles are a lot longer than they were even 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. Regulatory hurdles are a lot higher. Not just FDA and CE mark, but the good old days, you could go to a lot of geographies around the world, and with a hospital IRB, do a clinical study. But places like Brazil, China, Vietnam, New Zealand all have regulatory hurdles in place that weren't there that many years ago. Standards for verification and validation are far higher than they used to be. My very first 510K I ever saw was 12 pages long. That doesn't happen anymore, obviously. So a lot of companies have spent a lot of time and money doing remediation and redevelopment on products that were just to keep them on the market because they don't meet today's standards. And regulatory approval doesn't necessarily mean an option to exit anymore. Typically, getting to some level of reimbursement is the real inflection point for value. So that all leads to longer clinical studies, not just proving efficacy, but also getting data that shows the ability to prove economic efficacy. A better product that is more expensive may not necessarily have a lot of legs, as we all know these days. So fundamentally, this all extends the commercialization cycle. Now, obviously, spend goes up and down dramatically over the course of a product's life cycle. You can have the foot hard on the gas during development. You're waiting 6 months for an IDE study approval. You're hard on the brake, trying to get the study going again. You're ramping back up. It's classic and typical for our industry. But it's tough if you have a lot of brick and mortar and a lot of built-in structural burn rate and spend. And it's the same whether you're a startup, operating company, or a tier one. It just feels more painful and acute when you're in a startup, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So a wise man told me years ago, he said, you should never burn capital unless you're actually building value, which it's such a simple thing. I'm going to say it again because it was so profound to me. You shouldn't burn capital unless you're actually building value. So it's nice if you're able to turn the spend on and off to some degree. So that's one of the reasons why virtual outsourcing of development has really happened. It's possible to just put your partner in neutral for 6 months or 8 months while you get your IDE approval or get your study going, and then turn them back on afterwards. It's not quite that simple. It's not quite that easy, but that's part of the process. Also, the fact is, having virtual organizations is a lot more feasible now than it was when I was a young guy with hair running around the industry. Things that we take for granted today. You've got LinkedIn. You can find experts of any kind of variety in a few minutes. Didn't exist then. Cheap or free telecom, Videocon, WebEx, things like that. Even document sharing, Dropboxes and Google Docs and things like that, make it feasible and been pretty common to have companies that spread across a lot of states. So you got the necessity and you got the ability, and that's why so much of this stuff is happening nowadays. So there's a lot of benefits outsourcing development, but there are also perils and pitfalls and things to bear in mind. There is no free lunch out there, and I think the real focus for our panel is to talk about how it works, how to get the most out of your vendor partners. If you're a vendor, how to get the most out of your customers so it goes as smoothly and efficiently as possible. Okay? And the way we're going to talk it through is really sequentially, kind of following the product development process. So phase one really is talking about basically pre-engagement. Before you ever have a partner, what to think about when you're talking about partner selection, what kinds of partners you want to get. Phase two is planning. You got a partner, you're with somebody, planning what you're going to do and how you're going to get it done is not necessarily easy, but clarity is super important for later on. 3 is development, and 4 is often forgotten, is trying to move from development into manufacturing and how that should work and the perils and pitfalls there. Okay? So with that, I think we're going to dive right into the pre-engagement phase. So before you've selected a partner or doing anything else, how you go through that process. So Kim, I'm going to go to you first, actually. So you've been in companies big and small, and you worked with a lot of outside firms over the years, all different levels of maturity and so on. So what were your most significant concerns or criteria as you went in these kind of processes and had to pick someone who you're going to be tied to for a long and important period of time?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here again and see everybody. So in terms of picking a partner, as I think about an internal project or a virtual project, really it comes down to resources. And I think everybody would agree, and everybody in the audience is constantly balancing resources. But whether you're in a large company or a small company, it is the same. It's always about the resources. And as we think about resources, we have the infrastructure that you mentioned. That is an important consideration in the use of that infrastructure if you have it in place. The second is the financial resources and how, can, like you said, throttle them on and throttle them off, as well as the human assets that you have in the organization, and more importantly, the capabilities, right? So if you're developing something that requires a specific skill set that you don't have, then it makes a lot of sense to go out and find it from a virtual perspective. Determining whether you're going to be virtual or in-house with a project, again, has to do with those resources. And large companies often look at projects and evaluate whether there's a gap in the infrastructure or the talent in determining whether they need to fill that. And those are really where the considerations come from.
Mm-hmm. And beyond resourcing, are there some things that you feel like you really should keep internally so you can keep control? How do you weigh those things out of what you want to keep in or put out?
Sure. So I think from an external perspective and working remotely or virtually with teams, when you're early in the process of development and innovation, a lot of times companies, innovators, the engineering team wants to maintain some control until they get it to a point where they can actually turn it, either the idea or something, over to somebody. So a lot of companies will want to maintain that, kind of keep a hug around the technology, mm-hmm. right? Other times you have startups, for example, again, that don't have the capabilities to execute what they want to execute on from a new technology development, and they have to go out and find that, right? So it really does depend on where you are in the cycle and what resources you have available to you.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's tough. Sometimes there's a secret sauce or a certain super esoteric key technology that you have to keep internally.
That's right.
But a lot of the blocking and tackling, it's more of a resource-driven thing, I think. And Stuart, so you deal with a huge variety of customers, some very sophisticated, some not, some
right.
big, some small. The whole bell curve is out
Yep.
there. So what do your customers need to know, and what should they be asking people like you at this stage to help you get to the right place quickly and ultimately help them get to their destination?
Some of the things I think are obvious, which is, work out your development strategy. Know what it is before you start having conversations with myself or your potential partners, so you know how everybody will fit, how things get handed off, what the roles are. So I think that's important. I think finding a partner that has some relevant experience so that they could bring something to the table beyond just the development piece of it. But for me personally, after 34 years of having people show up in all different conditions, culture, I think, is really super important about making sure that the culture of the startup, the culture of the team, whatever it is, blends and will work well with the culture of the partner. Because ultimately, it is a relationship. Ultimately, you're getting married. There isn't huge opportunities to go on dates prior to that marriage. And people, one of the things that I've done in the growth of the firm is I'm selective myself about the people that we get involved with. And oftentimes people go like, oh, well, what's your criteria? And I said, it's very simple. It's sense of humor. That is ultimately what we look for in our potential clients. Because we're going to be in the trenches, we're going to be working together, and ultimately it needs to be fun.
Yeah. And can you maybe talk a bit about the need for clear objectives and clarity on the customer's part, and maybe a little bit how it works if things aren't clear enough?
Sure. Like I said, we've seen people show up and they're waving their hands and saying, this is what we need, and I need you to help, and this and that. The other end of the spectrum, we get a very well delineated RFP. In some cases, they'll share with us their research about what they're doing and where they're going, so we could have some foundation for actually figuring out what to do with them. Part of our role, I believe, is to help them gain clarity. So most of the time, what a typical scenario for us is when we're working with a startup, or what I call well-funded startups that have been through Series A that actually have the funding to pay us to do the work for them, is the technology has been proven out to a degree. And then they hire a marketing person to help commercialize it. And the marketing person comes in and says, no, we can't sell that. That doesn't look good. It's not the right colors. It doesn't have the right usability. We need to hire a firm to help us figure that out. And oftentimes, they actually haven't been focused on who is the actual user, or more importantly, what's the entire ecosystem that's going to be affected by this product. Because up until that point, the way I describe it is, they're just in love with their technology. And their goal is to prove out their technology works, but they're never really focused on whose hands is this going to be put into, and will those people connect with that product in a way that'll create traction, which ultimately will lead to dollars.
Yeah, clarity of requirements it's incredibly important, because you may have a clear picture in your mind, but it's very hard for a vendor to translate that. So I have an example. A customer came to us, and one of their main requirements was for the device to be, quote, spa-like, unquote. We have 180 engineers in our company. You have a bunch of engineers trying to translate what spa-like means. It was not very easy. So it was a lot of wrestling trying to figure out what spa-like is.
It's a little different than easy to use.
Easy to use. It's one thing, but spa-like's a whole different level, it seems.
By the way, we know what that is. So,
okay, so
yeah.
Stuart can help you translate spa-like for engineers and people like us. So maybe on the marriage topic a little bit, maybe both of you guys could comment on this in no particular order, but can you comment about how intertwined you tend to get? I mean, if you go down the road of virtual outsourcing, how intertwined you tend to get with customers? Maybe Kim, you want to go
Incredibly intertwined. I mean, it's like you said, it's a marriage. We have a small company. Our company is 12 employees right now, but I probably have 3 times as many consultants, right? And so in terms of you throttle up or down the consultant relationship based on where you are within the business cycle. Today we happen to be developing next generation technology, and I have folks in 6 different locations that we're working with to develop the next generation technology, and we're on the phone. I'm on the phone with one of them almost every day. I am personally, as well as half my team. So there is a very strong relationship, and like you said, there has to be that connection, whether it's sense of humor or mutual respect, whatever it might be. But speaking specifically about Minnetronix, I went up, I met with the CEO, I met with the entire team, I met with the team that was developing, I met with the team that would future potentially manufacture, and just made sure this was the group that I wanted to spend the next year with, and that our team wanted to spend the next year with. So I think it's incredibly important. Because when, like you said, when things get really tough and you got to solve big problems, or you have to unpack some very complex situations, you want to do it with people you like.
Yes. Divorce is not an option.
Right. No.
It's like a marriage with a kid. You can get divorced in theory, but you're going to be still intertwined.
I like that.
Yeah, a couple kids.
Yeah, a couple of kids.
One on the way.
Exactly, yeah.
let me just say that the more intertwined we are, the better it is. The more intertwined we get earlier, the better it is. The more intertwined we are with a CEO saying, you are going to use design as a strategic tool to make a difference. So, all of that is we're working towards getting intertwined. Where it goes awry is when members of that team have not been oriented to the fact that this is a role that needs to be fulfilled and that we can bring a lot of value to it, and people are staking out their own grounds, and it just gets, it doesn't get fun at that point.
Makes sense.
And I think where it can really go wrong is if you don't have the senior leadership or leadership generally involved. So I'll go back to like Spectranetics, mid-sized company, 2 divisions, big R&D departments. We did some outsourcing. And it's very easy for those folks not involved in the project or intertwined in the project when something is late or there's a problem or a budget overrun and they don't really understand what's happening. Just the kind of tension that gets created is really unnecessary.
Yeah.
And that is the symptom of not having the right people involved.
Right, exactly. And also, when things get nasty, coming together to solve it versus pointing fingers.
That's right.
Yeah, because with product development, one thing you know for sure the day you start is you're going to have problems along the way. It's just nature of the beast. So once you've worked through the kind of partner you need or partners you need, and sort of selected the categories, and then you found the partners you actually want within those categories, you get engaged, and then the whole planning process happens. So it's arguably the most important phase. So good, well-defined requirements drive good alignment, they drive clarity, and so on. It was incomplete or misaligned requirements or contradictory requirements can really hurt the success of a project, time, cost, all those kind of things. So back to Stuart, how do you know when you've landed on a fairly well thought out list of requirements and you're there?
So at Karten Design, we do design strategy, and for that part of it, we're actually becoming intimate with the business objectives of our client to understand really what they're trying to achieve. And being able to understand where they're lacking and where they're not. And I'll use an example with the project that we actually did with Minnetronix. So in some cases, you're developing a product that has a complete defined clinical pathway. It's a next evolution of a product, and it becomes clear. You know the people that are touching it and using it. And in that scenario, usually there's tribal knowledge that comes from the client, and maybe there's some additional work that we can do to bring something that could help leapfrog the next generation of it. But with the project we did with you guys, it was a completely new technology. It came out of UCLA, and it was acoustic emission. They were listening to knees pre and post implant in a way to make sure that it really was worthy of a knee implant. And then once the implant was in there, you could listen to it over time, and you could actually do some revisionary surgery earlier before you actually get an infection, and then you're done. But nobody's using that product, nobody's using that process, so it was imperative that we went out and tried to understand, is that a physical therapist device? Is it a orthopedic surgeon device? Where will it live? What's the engagement with the patient? Are they showing them anything? And so we had to do all of that upfront work to really create a good set of specifications for what the product will be.
Mm-hmm. And how do you handle it when a customer or prospect shows up, he has a project, and he or she thinks they've got a pretty well-defined set of requirements, and they're actually not quite as far along as they think they might be?
It starts simple with questions, just by asking them about, have they spent time, have they done that, where have they been, who's on your team, and through a series of questions, you can get people to truly understand or eventually come to terms with the fact that they probably haven't done all of the homework they need to do to, at the front end of the project, where you can actually, do it cheaper and simpler versus fixing things at the back end.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So Kim, so you've been along, developing this product or set of products. How does the stage of your project help define the selection criteria you have in your mind for a partner?
How does the stage of the product?
Yeah, if you're really early stage prototype versus trying to do real development.
I think it comes down to the capabilities of the firm that you're selecting, right? And their bandwidth and their ability to take on your product. I'd also speak, from a startup perspective to, Medtronic, large to mid-sized organizations. There are some partners that just work with the big companies, right? And there are other partners that work with small companies and are incredibly customer-oriented and see the bigger picture in terms of kind of the startup will someday become something more, or the people at the startup will someday be part of some big company, right? So I would say that it depends on what seat you're in, right? You're looking for the capabilities within the development partner and make sure that there's a match with what you're trying to do based on that phase. But the other side of it is knowing that, I think there's a gap with startups and development partnerships and the opportunity, because I think startups don't get the same kind of attention that some of the mid or large-sized companies are getting.
Yeah.
So your ability to shop around as a startup is more difficult. And it's nice to work with, like a firm like Minnetronix, that, we're a startup, and I believe we've got one of the best teams on our project, right? And that's rare. And on the other side, we have another project happening with another firm, and again, they do work for Johnson & Johnson, and again, we're being treated like Johnson & Johnson. And so as a startup, we really value that, because that's playing for the long term as opposed to the very short period of time that we're in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing to bear in mind is that no vendor is good at everything, and if a vendor tells you they're good at everything, they're lying, or they're delusional, or maybe they're both. But
capabilities, yeah.
Yeah, there are things that Minnetronix is just not good at. It's just a fact of life. We're not good at everything. We're good at certain things, and I think finding that match of a customer who needs things that the vendor can actually provide at a high level. And I think both parties have to be willing and able to say no, right? If the vendor's not good for the customer, even if they're a little bit down the road, you need to be able to pull the eject button before you get to be too intertwined and have 3 kids and buy a house before the divorce, to use a bad analogy, and just be really clear early on. And for the vendor too, if you're in the audience and you're a vendor and a customer needs something you really can't do, it's really incumbent on you to tell the customer, like, that's kind of this far out of our wheelhouse. We're not going to do a great job at that. You should probably go see someone different. It's just better for everybody in the long run.
I think that's really important. I think I always invoke the Popeye statement, I am who I am. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're good at. and then other people are good at other things, and it would be a disservice for me to take on something for a client to pretend or act as if I actually have expertise in that area.
Right.
So.
I was going to be a professional basketball player, except for I was slow, not that tall, and didn't have a good feel for the game, and had poor ball handling skills, and shooting. But apart from that, I was going to do great in the NBA. So I'm doing this instead.
Admirable.
Well, and I'll just comment that
good for everybody.
Along those lines, I'm sure coaches appreciated that honesty. And I would
they were honest with me, I think.
that the companies that you partner with appreciate that honesty as well, so that we can quickly get to some decisions, right?
Yes.
And know that they respect that.
And I think it comes back to the earlier comment. That's about trust,
yes.
Right? That builds trust. When people are honest, that builds trust, and that is the foundation for a partnership that could actually have longevity.
Yeah, and confidence too. If you're a customer out there looking for a partner, if someone isn't a fit, you can find someone who's a fit if you keep looking. You will find the right partner. You'll find the right lid for that pot. If you settle early on, it's never going to work out. And if you're a vendor, businesses are lumpy. That's the name of the game. But trying to shoehorn yourself into a situation where you're not going to be able to thrive, it's a bad idea. You're better off looking for a customer who's a better fit for what you can actually do and accomplish, it feels like. So move on to the next phase of actually getting into design. So you've got a partner, it's all sorted out, you got a plan, you're into development. So Kim, you're in the design phase and you're into it, you got requirements set, and you're going down the road of actually doing design development. And maybe you've got a European organization, a US organization who've discovered that maybe they want different things, the product to be different, or they're different ideas. From your experience, those internal advocates or factions or people with different ideas, do they typically understand the impact of requirements changes or design changes when you're already sort of mid-trajectory or midstream?
Frequently not. But I would tell you that it's incumbent upon the team that's leading the project, defining the requirements to close the gap and make sure that, you know, that you don't have that kind of tension between Europe and US in the middle of a project, right? And so if you're kicking off, if your engineering team or your development team is kicking off a project, then shame on them if they've got a disconnect between, that far of a disconnect between Europe and the United States. And I think that, again, going back to requirements, getting that done, getting that right from the very beginning, it's obvious, but can't be emphasized enough, because even the smallest changes hit your schedule and hit your budget, and it can be impactful, whether it be depending on a product launch or a clinical trial or even a financing for a small company.
Yeah, it's huge, I would agree. And so on the other side of the table, Stuart, so if you're well into a design phase and a customer calls you with news that they want to make a significant change to the product or the requirements or whatever,
Right.
How do you handle that request or that conversation?
Well, there's two sides to it. One is, where did it come from? Is it valid? You know, do we need to prove it? You know, is it really being, I mean, if it's coming that far into the process, to your point, something went wrong in the beginning where we missed something, so you'd have to kind of reconcile it in terms of whether it's truly a valid change or not. From a contractual standpoint, we do almost everything on fixed fee. And we leave latitude for no nickel and diming, so it has to be a significant change for us to raise our hand and say, you know what, this is going to be a really a scope change, and we're going to have to talk about money as well. But that conversation we avoid like crazy. But with something as significant as like going from a console to a handheld, that's huge.
It's big.
It's big.
Yeah, it's like I like house building analogies, because everyone can relate to building a house. And you can change the floor plan after the whole thing has already been framed.
Yeah.
It is absolutely possible.
Yeah.
It's just going to take a lot of time and money to go back and undo things and redo things when it's under construction.
Yeah, just to build on that a little bit, where my mind goes with that is if there's that sort of a change midway through, there's an issue with leadership at that point. And I think, you know, just as a coaching tip to the audience, you know, the most successful projects that we've executed has a strong leader on the client side that can make the hard calls and avoids it from being a completely democratic process. And that is just somebody has to play that role. When there isn't that role, then it's politicking and just ineffective, you know, project management and team management.
Yeah, completely agree. Completely agree. And that's a really tough team. I can only imagine what that's like when in your shoes, dealing with that, right?
Yep.
And the level of frustration.
Yeah.
But, you know, the other side of it that I would say is that if you have a legitimate improvement that's identified midstream, and you can support it from an ROI perspective. So if by delaying the project and going over budget drives cost out or improves a feature that will drive additional adoption that you hadn't planned, then you got to pause and take the time to evaluate that, right? So that's the flip side of it. It's, you know, we can talk a lot about requirements or dysfunction or lack of leadership, but then there, you know, keep your eyes open for those meaningful breakthroughs for the organization from a cost perspective over time, or an increase in revenue that could be reflective of that change.
And to build on that, you know, we're big proponents of getting out to the users as early as possible.
Yeah.
So if at some point you're putting this out and it's part of that iterative, as people have talked about, fail forward fast, and you're taking away a learning, that has to be, you know, embraced and acted on.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, in a past life, I did a little detour in my career into R&D and process development operations, and we'd finished developing and articulating a steerable catheter years and years ago in a past life, and we had just finished, and a competitive product popped out on the market, and it was great. It was really a great product, and they clearly had leapfrogged this thing we had just finished developing, and we had no choice but to go back and do it again.
Wow.
Oh,
Was that before you were in the MBA?
Sorry?
Was that before you were in the MBA?
Yes. That solidified my career change. It really did. But that was a heartbreaker, but it was necessary. To your point, it's like we could have plunged ahead with what we had, but it suddenly went from being a big leap forward to being a half a step behind. And that was an unpleasant realization. But reality intrudes in your life sometimes.
When you may be too married to what you're doing, right?
Right, exactly. So So going beyond design and into the next phase that people, I think, tend to kind of forget about is, there's a transition between development and actually trying to produce something. You can develop something and hand whittle one of anything and make it work and have a team of engineers babysitting it, but producing stuff in volume is a different game, and how well you do or don't do that. So Kim, I mean, how in your past lives, your current life, I mean, how important has it been or not been to have development and manufacturing linked somehow, or under the same roof, or attached in some way?
Naturally, there's an economies of scale by having everything under one roof. However, you may not always have that opportunity. So whether it's within, the organization itself, having the development and the design transfer to manufacturing all under one roof, that'd be great. That'd be perfect, because you have more controls overall with that, from quality to cost to consistency in team, et cetera. But then moving to a virtual environment, do you strive to have your development and your manufacturing in one place? Again, that would be ideal, but it's not always the case, especially if you're doing capital and disposable, right? And so, for example, you talked earlier about, there's some things we're really good at and some things we're not. And I found, at least in my research, that not everybody does capital and disposable. And if that's your business, then you're definitely not going to have everything under one roof if you're outsourced. So you have to then be very deliberate about selecting those partners that can develop and design transfer to manufacturing. And you may end up with 2 groups or 3 groups or 4 groups to get all that done. Mm-hmm. And you need to just make sure that your staff is resourced to support that if in fact you're in that place.
Yeah. I think it goes back to that phase 1, that pre-engagement phase, right, of having that strategy worked out. Because sometimes your ideal development partner may not be your ideal manufacturing, yep, partner. Maybe they are. Yep. But having that thought through in advance and being able to shift directions during the planning cycle if it's not quite what you thought when you got in is key. So that makes perfect sense. So Stuart, I mean, good design should equal, good or easier manufacturing. Not always, yep, the case. Never quite that easy. Right. And what happens if you're in a late phase, in phase 4, and you find something that didn't catch earlier, and you have to go back and correct something?
Well, we fix it.
Okay. Pretty straightforward.
Back to your point, because we're involved in the front end, it really has to be delineated who we're passing the ball to. So whether it's a well-funded startup that's going to go to a contract engineering firm that has contract manufacturing, or one or the other is split, it's really important, because the way we've been able to succeed is to bring those people in as early as possible and put them on the team with us, so that we're not working in a vacuum, developing designs and ideas without having some reference check of what's going to be received. It gives them a sense of ownership as well. Over the 34 years that I've done this, the sort of the black eye of industrial design, I still walk into potential new clients and they say, yeah, we had a horrible experience with an industrial design firm. What was that? Well, they showed us some amazing renderings, but we couldn't make anything. Right. And that is why we have mechanical engineers on staff, and we have what I call design engineers. These are designers with hybrid degrees, or they think like engineers, but they have the sensibilities of designers, so that when we're presenting designs, we're presenting construction strategy, we're looking towards some production processes early on in the process to make sure that when it does get passed, it's competent and it can be produced.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Do we have any questions in the audience? We don't want to totally monopolize your time and just talk at you. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Can you hear that in the back? I think the question's around how much are you seeing consortiums of vendors working together to get things done? Yeah, I think it tends to be, if you agree, Stuart, I think, from my view, it tends to be relationship-driven. Projects kind of come and go, the needs come and go. Some customers really would like to have more of a formal structure between their vendor base. Some don't. I'd say they're hard to maintain, is my general view. They tend to kind of come and go. I don't know, what's your sense, Stuart?
I haven't really seen that. It's nothing that I would subscribe to. I think having the freedom to pick and choose and to suggest a potential CE if they have expertise on a certain field, the size of the company, there's so many factors that go into what makes up that composite of partners that I think having the flexibility, at least especially when we're at the front end and we can kind of see where it's going, would be valuable. So bonding people together just for having built-in relationships doesn't really subscribe to the way we work.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it is, it has to be flexible. For example, I think ID firms, we work with a huge variety of ID firms. We worked with Karten a few times over the years. But different firms have different design aesthetics. The customer prefers one over the other. What are you going to do? And I know you work with other development and manufacturing companies over the years.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. People do different things.
I would completely agree. I think I haven't been presented with a package like that, but I can tell you that we do have it. I mean, it came about very organically in that you start down the path with one group, and then you find out you need this and you need that. You kind of bring it together based on what you need. So that flexibility is critical.
Do we have any other questions? I actually have a question. I have a question about requirements, because I feel like that's one of the really tough things that companies often make mistakes in. Do you have any tips for developing requirements that are actually going to be successful that you can turn into?
Customers. I can't emphasize it enough. The end user, the voice of customer, having a really robust process in going out and getting voice of customer. It's not as simple as talking to a handful of your busy users. It's making sure that you have a broad view of somebody who's done one case or has an experience with a low volume to somebody who has very high volume. And that's important, because if you want to scale a technology and drive adoption, you have to be able to launch that product with multiple users and multiple skill sets, right? So I think the voice of customer, in my opinion, is the number one thing, because that's where you get tripped up, where my customer needs this or my customer needs that, and a very skilled person who can, generally it's an upstream marketer or an engineer or somebody on the BD side, can go in and start to look at what those common themes are to make sure that we're covering the right requirements from that perspective.
So we get asked to do this a lot, and it is part of what our service is, to actually help companies go out and understand and create requirements. We call it the voice of the ecosystem. Even though you're calling a customer, you're talking to multiple people. And there's a couple of tenets that we live by, which is we want to make sure that we're talking to everybody in that ecosystem. So for example, we did a project recently that was around an elastomeric pain pump, and they were looking for where is there going to be innovation, can we create a digital platform, and the framework that we used to actually get kind of all those voices was through a patient journey, to understand what somebody went through when they were going to have a knee replaced, and they were going to have this device attached to them, and who they were talking to, who recommended it. And what was amazing is the client thought, well, it's the anesthesiologist. That's who's the person that's going to make the decision about purchasing this product. And it turned out that it's actually the surgeon, because if the surgeon doesn't specify it and include it as part of his process and the pathway, then it never gets in place. And and then what we did is we made that journey visual. We made a huge poster. This is part of what we do at Karten Design, is take the research, take the findings, make a big visual poster that doesn't live in a PowerPoint on a computer. It lives in the working environment of our clients, and it's constantly referenced and looked at and amortized over time to see if there's places where improvements can be made. Did we actually make sure we spoke to the staff, nurse, and all of those things? So that's just some of the things that we do.
Completely agree.
Yeah, I'd say that customer requirements and user requirements are really, really hard to get right. And if you get them wrong, everything builds on that. That's the one major aspect. The other aspect is FDA and CE, the reg systems are really built on the idea of linkages between customer requirements to product requirements, and product requirements to design requirements, and design requirements to verification and validation requirements, and specs used to actually build and release product. And I would say probably less than 10% of people in the industry actually get those connections. At the very end, you should be able to look at any spec you're measuring at the very end when you're shipping a product out and be able to trace that individual spec, why you're measuring X, Y, or Z, all the way back through that chain to an original customer requirement. But it's very easy to lose those linkages. You're going along with customer requirement, some design requirements, and all of a sudden it gets lost. So it's very important to make sure that all your outputs from phase 1 go into phase 2, and all those design eval outputs, they go into the design. And it's very easy to lose the plot. So when you're doing phase reviews and so on, making sure those linkages are all one-to-one and nothing gets lost along the way or gets garbled or misinterpreted, it's hugely important. So having the marketing folks and the development people all understand that system and how it's got to work, that's how you avoid having those kind of gaps, I'd say.
With your experience in the industry and the diverse customer base you're dealing with, from well-funded startups to well-established OEMs and everyone in between, you're obviously very focused on the customer experience, voice of the customer, requirements, changes, large or small. Stuart, you indicated that in some cases you allow or have accommodate initially in the project for slight changes or some variance with the scope if that was appropriate, if I heard you correctly. Do you see and prefer and or feel there's more success in managing the projects, and Jim, yourself with Minnetronix, relative to a firm fixed cost or time and material? And I guess what's your opinion on that? Because we see all over, and Jim, as you were saying, every customer has a different perspective and perception of things, and some prefer A and some prefer B relative to everything. I'm just curious on the cost management, what you see and what you think works best potentially.
For us, in the 34 years that I've been in business, I can count on my hand the number of times we did T&M. And it was because the client just said, no, I want to do it that way. Or it was such an open-ended project that I couldn't even wrap our minds around how much time it would take for us to do it. I always filtered it in the beginning from a customer experience. Buying a car sucks, right? Because you walk in and you really don't know what you're going to pay. And it's a dance and it's a game and it's painful, and so I always thought the best customer experience I could offer is, you asked me to do this, I'm going to charge you this much, and let's just start and work on the project.
I'll build on that from a company perspective. That's how it should be. Mm-hmm. This time and material concept, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody by saying this, but it tells me you don't know what you're doing, or the alternative, the other side of that, is that we have a project that is so on Mars that we can't predict, right? And so that, I think, from a industry perspective, I think that's true. I think especially with startups need to be able to control their cost. Capital efficiency is the game. Milestones are a currency, right? And it is so critical to be able to budget accordingly. And there's always some variances there, but the time and materials is really tough.
And I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. It sets up an adversarial relationship of distrust. So you told me that you're not going to exceed $50,000, but you'll track it and then we'll see. So the whole way through you're like, am I going to get screwed here or not, right?
Yeah,
that's the mentality.
And I'll give you guys an example. I was dealing with some software development recently, and one of the engineers went down, got sick or something. So I ended up getting saddled with a more expensive engineer, and I'm on time and materials in that situation. And I'm pissed now because I've paid double because of that, as opposed to having a set project price, and it's upon the contractor to figure that out on their end, on their costs,
right.
not on my time and money, right?
Yep.
So developing those relationships, establishing that trust. I'll tell you, you see if there's repeat business in that situation.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, and we've done both. We've done T&M and fixed bid projects. I'd say the biggest thing is the degree to which a vendor can fix their costs,
Yep.
they can fix their pricing.
Yep.
If there's a lot of variability or vagary, you may have to do 2 loops or 3 loops, it's hard for them to do a fixed bid without having to really build a lot of buffer in, which has its own downsides. So,
But you can define that.
yeah, generally
You
speaking.
can, you can put some guardrails around it.
And
That's,
some are super, you need fixed bids for fixed scope.
yep, exactly.
The biggest thing. And some things are very definable. You're doing, say, QC testing. You got a sample size figured out, you know, how much time it's going to take. You
Yeah.
should be able to be pretty accurate on those kind of
Now, if you guys
estimates.
are doing a lot of exploratory and there's a lot of unknowns and you're innovating and you know, that, I get that. That's a joint risk you take
Yeah.
on.
The degree of R versus D is the
That's right.
balancing act there. Other questions? So I think there's some themes definitely coming through here. I would say that generally speaking, you know, clarity of objectives is super important. If the objectives aren't clear, the roadmap is almost impossible to build. Clarity of expectations is super duper clear, and having struggles in those early stages, pre-engagement, not having the right partner, not having a good plan in the second stage, really can cause a lot of difficulties later on in terms of time, money, headache, pain, angst, drama, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are probably some of the key takeaways. But do you have last comments you'd like to share? I mean, Stuart, go first.
You know, the thing I'd probably want everybody to think about is that we're living in a world where there's kind of a perfect storm that's happening right now. And I think it's indicative of CVS's purchase of Aetna and what I call the consumerism of healthcare. So in all the years that I've practiced, early on, it was easy. You were developing a medical product, it was going into a clinician's hands, you knew the environment that they were living in, and you knew their education level, you knew, there were just certain givens. Now, our products are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, they're going into people's homes, the public's using them, the public's interested in their health. So because of the work we've done in consumer products where people actually have choice around what they want and what they can get, ultimately that is what's going to happen in the medical field. Even in the hardcore hospital devices, they're going to have choice, and their decisions are going to be based on their real life experiences and the devices that they work with and the user interfaces and all the things that drive their day-to-day living are like, why can't this be like my smartphone? And you see Apple, you see CVS, Walgreens, all these consumer companies, Samsung, that are invading the space. That's a big watch out, and to not be just doing business as usual.
Yeah, I would just say, so the topic started out as this virtual, how do you work with virtual partners? And I would say that we're probably going to be doing more of it, not less, right? And so with that, I would give 2 pieces of advice. One is measure twice, cut once. I think that goes back to do the upfront work. Everything from selecting your partner to get married, to defining your requirements, to setting your budget, negotiating so that you don't have any surprises and that relationship works out in a very nice way. And then the second is just always test assumptions along the way, right? Because you're going to be, you just don't like surprises. Nobody likes surprises on either side. So if you're constantly checking assumptions on both sides, then you can avoid that.
And my last 2 cents here, I think, we tend, as a group, we're problem-solving kind of people, right? That's why we're all here, and we tend to look at the world in terms of problems we're going to solve. The world's not the same as it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Regulatory is different, reimbursement is different, physicians are different, healthcare is different, and so on and so forth. But I think we do have options today that we never had before, and to some degree, we're living in a bit of a golden age where we could do things virtually and without having to have a brick and mortar structure and a colossal burn rate. That just wasn't very possible 20 years ago. So even as we solve problems and knock down barriers, we should bear in mind that we are living in a kind of a golden era of things that are very doable. And we can still do great things in medtech, still help people, still build great businesses, and make the world a better place. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you very much, Stuart and Kim. Appreciate it very, very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate everything.